Welcome back to Family Communication. In previous videos, we've talked about what makes family communication unique. Starting with this video, we'll spend several videos talking about some broad lenses through which to see family communication. These are overarching kinds of ways of understanding family communication. And it's not as if any of these particular lenses are right or wrong. Instead, they're just different ways of looking at things. One researcher calls them different facets of a diamond. While that may be true, the reality is most of us are drawn to seeing family interactions through one particular lens. You'll see that as we talk about each of these in turn. Remember, each of these comes from a research-based perspective, meaning that there is research supporting each of the different lenses we'll talk about. For that reason alone, one is not wrong and the other is right, or vice versa. Instead, each of these simply becomes one of many different ways of understanding what's going on in family communication. It's as if we say, if you look at it through this lens, then you draw this conclusion. But if you look at it through that lens, you may come to a different conclusion. So let's start with one of the most common lenses of all. It's a functional lens. The functional lens is among the most common that sociologists use to understand any kind of social phenomena. The functional lens goes all the way back to a sociologist called Emil Durkheim. And the premise of the functional lens is what the title implies. The best way to understand family communication is to ask, what's the function of that communication? Or to put it differently, in asking the question, why do people communicate like that in the family? The answer is because it's useful. It gets something done. It accomplishes some purpose. It has some role to play in the larger context of the family. Durkheim was convinced that social life was much like this, that everything we do socially, we do for a purpose. If you understand that purpose, then you understand that particular piece of social behavior. So applied to a family context, the functional lens wants to say, I can understand why people communicate the way they do because when they do so, it serves a particular function. And so the functional lens wants to continue to search for the function of different kinds of communication. So let me give you an example of a common kind of family communication that might be looked at through a functional kind of lens. Oftentimes we find that in married couples, one of the two spouses is the keeper of the schedule. And it's true in the research in the United States of America, in fact in much of the Western world, it's the female that does that. So many conversations in the family setting occur over the schedule. Are we having dinner with someone after church this Sunday or not? What time are we supposed to go to such and such a house to play cards with them? Don't forget, we have to get Bobby to his soccer match, and then we have to get Janie to her soccer match. Don't forget to pick up milk on the way home. And by the way, make sure you get that whole milk, none of that skim stuff. All those kinds of conversations can be seen through the lens of the functional perspective because they all get something done. They remind people about how the schedule is supposed to work, where people need to be, when they need to be there. In a sense, they're articulating responsibilities for each member of the family. So Durkheim and other sociologists that study family interactions would answer the question, why do people continually talk about the schedule? Well, because it's functional. But so too are other kinds of communication as well. So for instance, many families have a habit, Christian families that is, of having devotionals with their kids. So these family devotionals become a kind of functional communication. The function is to pass on from one generation to the next the practices and the principles of the Christian faith. So from a functional lens, we know exactly why that's happening. A teenager might say about her mom, my mom is always yelling at me. She's always on my case. Well, when the teenager says that, she's not looking at things through the functional lens. Her mother, on the other hand, is. Her mother continues to correct the teenage daughter because the mother believes it's important for her to instill values in the daughter. It's important to foster a certain kind of behavior and prohibit another kind of behavior. And so she repeatedly says to her daughter that she should do this or shouldn't do that. Now the daughter sees that as yelling, but to the mom, it makes perfectly good sense. It's called parenting. And so from the mother's perspective, it's entirely functional. Another common kind of communication is the daily debriefing. Husbands and wives, when they get together at the end of the day, oftentimes debrief one another. How was your day today? How did the kids do at school? Are things working out for you at work? Those kinds of conversation starters end up debriefing at the end of the day. And in fact, there is much research that finds that the daily debriefing is a rather dull but important part of maintaining family life. In fact, a bit later on in this video, we'll have more to say about that kind of dull communication. But for now, grab a hold of the fact that this daily debriefing is functional because it brings people into the circle of your life. If I can share with my wife what happened at work today, that functionally serves the purpose of including her in my life. And so it's very important to her that I do that. And in fact, I make a point to do just that. We also understand that things like texting, the expectations before you leave a place, or texting to indicate that you've arrived at a place, also becomes very functional. It's a way of letting people know where you are and what's going on. So there are lots of obvious examples of the functional lens, and that should be no surprise to anyone because the functional lens is quite common. But a very different way of looking at family communication is what's called critical systems theory. Critical systems theory is promulgated, among others, by Annie Lareau, L-A-R-E-A-U, Lareau. Lareau, like other critical systems theorists, is interested in power. And they believe that the lens through which to understand communication is to ask, how is the communication used to exert power, to maintain power, or to create power? Because they believe that all power occurs within a system of some kind. So, for example, in the Western world, it's quite common for children to refer to their parents by their role title. So my kids call me Dad. They call my wife Mom because she is their mother. They don't refer to me as Brian. They don't call my wife by her name Sharon. They call her Mom. Is she a mom? Yes. Is she their mom? Yes. Is her name Sharon? Yes. But they use the role title. In fact, most kids tend to do that. Now, not every kid does, but most kids tend to. And so the use of that role title is a subtle way of reaffirming power. It's a subtle reminder, hey, I'm your dad. I have more power than you. If you call me Brian and I call you Luke, which is my son's name, then that puts us on relatively equal ground. But if he calls me Dad, it reminds him and me that I have this role that he doesn't have. He's got a name, Luke. I have a name, but I have a role, and the role title is more often used. And so Lareau and other critical systems theorists are interested in how the family system is set up to create power, to continue to exert power. And for Lareau and other people, communication is central to doing exactly that. So ask yourself this question. In your family, what do you have to ask permission in order to do? So as an emerging adult, when you go back home for Christmas break, do you have to ask your family permission to go somewhere with your friends? Do you have to let them know that you're going to be home late? In fact, do you have to let them know anything about your plans? Asking permission and letting people know can be viewed as a very functional thing. From your parents' perspective, if you come home for Christmas break and are going to go out with your friends, they'd like to know whether you're going to be there for dinner or not. So that way they make the right food or enough food. So asking the question, so what time will you be home? From the mom's perspective, functional lens is helpful. It's useful. But from a critical systems perspective, it's controlling. It's an intrusion of privacy. It is a way of subtly putting the child in a position where they have less power because they have to tell the parent what's going on or ask permission to go with their friends. And so critical systems theory would say that notions of permission or notions of filling people in on your plans could be seen through the lens of power. And so what critical systems theory wants to do is look around for the power. Now, as you might imagine, certain contexts lend themselves to one or more of these particular theories. In the critical systems theory, we find that it is highly useful for explaining what goes on in blended families or in second marriages. Oftentimes in blended family contexts, you run into a situation where power is often being exerted. So the mother who's remarried a husband who brought two kids into this marriage, second one for him, first one for her, those kids might have a hard time accepting her as their mother, as their stepmother, as someone who is part of the family. And so critical systems theory would say that oftentimes the communication between the father and the kids, or the kids and the mom, the stepmom in this case, can be best be viewed as trying to exert power. So for example, when the stepmom tries to discipline the kids that are not her biological kids, but are her stepchildren, the children may see that as being not credible, inappropriate. It's not her place to do that. Their father can because he's their biological father, but she is just the stepmom and might not have earned the right to do that. And so, in their eyes, and when she tries to discipline them through the lens of critical systems theory, she's trying to exert power when she has no right to exert power. Well, you can imagine a number of other contexts that might occur in a blended family situation, and critical systems theory can be used there to explain how that particular kind of thing might work out. A third broad lens through which to see family communication harkens back to some things we talked about in a previous video. Previously, we talked about family rituals. We talked about how it is people do things repetitively, and the things they do repetitively are endowed with meaning. We didn't know it at the time, but when we talked about all that, we were actually illustrating the third of the broad lenses to be talked about in this video, and that is what's called the patterned communication lens. Patterned communication lens was put forth by Mary Ann Fitzpatrick, one of the foremost researchers in family communication. And Fitzpatrick is interested in what we might call the dull, mundane, everyday kinds of communication that occur in a family setting. So all of those conversations that you might look at as being not important, the kinds of conversation that occur as you ride in the car with your parents as they take you to school, the kinds of conversation that occur in the car as you drive to and from church, the kinds of conversation you have as you stand in the kitchen and make a sandwich, just chatting with your mom. For Mary Ann Fitzpatrick, the communication in a family oftentimes falls into a pattern. We oftentimes tell the same stories to one another in the family. Oftentimes we have certain routines we fall into communicatively, whether it be debriefing at the end of the day or who knows what. Now, from a functional lens, the way to look at these kinds of things is to say, well, what function do they serve? But Fitzpatrick offers a more narrow way of looking at those kinds of communication. She believes that what's happening there is that this pattern communication is reinforcing the structure of a family. Or to put it differently, rather than focus on a very broad notion of what's the function, she wants to hone in on a specific function and say it's the reinforcement of the family's system. It's the reinforcement of what the family does. So, for instance, I've said a couple of times that oftentimes when people are getting ready in the morning, there are certain routines they follow. They tend to shower or brush teeth or get dressed or have breakfast or gather school books together or stuff together for work. And there's kind of a patterned routine that people tend to follow in the morning. And so therefore, a lot of the communication that occurs follows that patterned routine. Well, Fitzpatrick would say that that dull, patterned routine communication is really quite important, not just from a functional standpoint. I mean, broadly speaking, that is the case. From a narrow standpoint, what that communication does is it reinforces everyone's role in the family, kind of keeps the family moving in the manner in which it's supposed to be kept moving. In this regard, it is, in a sense, continuing what had previously been started. So, for example, one of the things that I said earlier is that people will tell stories in a family setting. And you might remember from a previous video, I talked about a family member who's clumsy, and the family sometimes teases her about that. I also said that sometimes a family story can be about the clumsiness of this family member. Well, those family stories are told over and over and over again, and so we're not only reinforcing the moral, which is what we talked about earlier with family stories, this patterned kind of communication reinforces the entire system of the family. It reinforces this is a member of the family. We have the right to tease her about this. She is supposed to put up with it. This is how it's supposed to be. So in essence, the pattern communication lens wants to say the communication occurs for the very narrow function of continuing the family in the manner of interaction that it's been set upon. In a sense, it's like glue that holds the family together. Or alternatively, to borrow a concept from physics, it keeps the family momentum moving forward. Now, by the way, this is important because sometimes in a marital context, a husband and a wife will be separated for some period of time. Let's say, for example, that a husband and wife are married and she takes a job in a city 200 miles away. Well, they can FaceTime each other and they can text each other and they can Snapchat one another and all sorts of stuff. They don't get to be together that often. Well, that Snapchat, the FaceTiming, the texting back and forth, that's all well and fine, but it's really a poor replacement for the mundane kinds of everyday communication that would occur face-to-face. So the research suggests that oftentimes when married couples experience a time of separation, for good reason, what ends up happening is there's a stress and strain on that marriage, more often than not. And so what we find then is that one reason for that stress and strain is that the momentum of the marriage, the usual pattern of interaction, has been upset. It's the same basis for why it is in research on romantic dating relationships, long distance relationships are comparatively harder to maintain than in town face to face relationships. Regardless, in the big picture, what Marianne Fitzpatrick and others want to point out is that those patterns of communication, the recurring, everyday, mundane kinds of things, become really important because it continues to move the family forward. That's one reason why, when you come home from college and you're back in the house for the first time after many months, the regular pattern of interaction is upset. Family has to adjust themselves to your presence. They have to adjust themselves to the fact that you're back in the house and have upset the pattern of communication. There's this concept that is known as equilibrium, the idea that you keep things well balanced. Well, pattern communication allows for that to occur. When you go off to school, it's out of balance. But pretty soon there begins to find a balance until you return home again, and then it's unbalanced. And so if you've ever had that experience of having that awkwardness, that adjustment period to being back at home, it's because in part the patterns of communication have been upset and they're not quite what they used to be. The next lens to talk about in this particular video is what's called interdependence lens. This is actually an economic kind of way of understanding family communication. It comes from two different individuals, Harold Kelly and John Thibault. Now, Thibault has kind of a French Cajun last name. It's spelled Thibault. 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 At any rate, Kelly and Thibault argue that the way to understand family communication is to think of the behavior in a family as kind of a constant assessment of costs and rewards. Whether you like it or not, you and your family are interdependent. You depend on one another. Your lives are woven together. It's one reason why, as I said a moment ago, when you come back into the family, that equilibrium is upset. Because there was a weaving, then there was an unraveling, then they adjusted to you being gone, but you came back and you unraveled the interdependence again. But families always mesh back towards some level of interdependence. Well, Kelly and Thibault argue that the heart of this interdependence is the assessment of costs and rewards, the idea of benefits and detriments. So their argument is the best way to understand communication is to think about it as understanding that people tend to communicate in such a way as to be profitable for them, to bring them rewards. So for instance, one of the things we know is that husbands oftentimes are reticent to share specific details about their day or about their life with their spouses. Comparatively speaking, wives are much more free with the details they share about their day and with the things they share with their husband about their particular world. Well, this creates a kind of deficiency of things. Why doesn't the husband share as much detail as the wife? While there might be many explanations for that, Kelly and Thibault would argue that the husband probably doesn't feel as much of a reward in doing so. In fact, quite the opposite. He perceives a kind of cost. He might not enjoy those conversations. He might think those conversations are not relevant or think that they're not interesting. Or he might want to compartmentalize work from home, and so to talk about work is for him detrimental. It's a cost. But to the wife, when she shares the details of her life, she's including the husband in her world. It's functional. At the same time, by finding out what the husband has going on at work or in his life, she's including herself in his world. He's allowing her in, which is not only functional, it brings a reward. And so for Kelly and Thibault, the wife continues to ask the husband to share what happened at work because not only is it functional to include her, it brings a reward to her. That sense of inclusion for her is a very positive kind of a thing. And so it's not surprising that many wives feel as if their husbands don't share enough detail with them about their work life or about what's going on in their head or in their heart because the husband oftentimes doesn't see the reward in it. It's also another reason why for many husbands, the idea of talking things out over and over again is one that they are not enamored with. They'd rather talk about it once and then move on, because to them, to continue to talk about it doesn't bring reward. In fact, quite the opposite, it brings cost. And so Kelly and Thibault encourage us to think about how it is we understand costs and rewards in a particular interaction. Now, this doesn't just work verbally, it also works non-verbally as well. So, for example, Many times husbands think that they can score big points with their wife by getting them a splashy gift or by surprising them with something they think they're really going to like. And so in that particular instance, the husband feels as if he's done something to earn big rewards. In reality, sometimes the wife doesn't respond in the way that he hoped that she would. And so he gets a smaller reward. That frustrates the husband, and the wife can't understand the husband's frustration because she feels as if she's responding appropriately. In fact, while it is a very nice surprise, it's a big gift, it's a splashy gift, the wife doesn't necessarily attach big points to that. Regardless, non-verbally, inside the husband's head, he's thinking in terms of rewards. And so we can see that both verbally and non-verbally, thinking about family communication from the lens of costs and rewards becomes a fruitful way to understand how it is people make sense of the family communication. And then the final lens we'll talk about in this particular video is what's called an equity lens. Equity comes from Edwin Hatfield, and as the term equity implies, it has to do with perceptions of equality. Hatfield believes that in any relationship, people put something into it, and they expect others to also put something into it. In any relationship, we all get something out of it, and so we expect others to also get something out of it. So for Hatfield, relationships are much like bank accounts. You make deposits, you have withdrawals. Or to put it differently, you make investments. We sometimes talk about investing in this relationship. So a husband might say to his wife, I really think you should invest more in this marriage. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, he might mean many things. He might mean that she makes more of an effort to be around for him and the children. He might mean that she makes more of an effort to have physical relations with him. He might mean that she makes more of an effort to talk with him. It can mean many things, but the fact of the matter is he's perceiving an inequity. He feels like he's putting more into it than she is. We find equity oftentimes in parenting. It's quite common for many mothers to believe that they are shouldering far more of the child rearing than is their husband. So for example, whether it be specific things like changing diapers for infants or larger things like having good conversations with the kids, wives often perceive that they are doing more of that than their husbands are. Or to put it differently, they feel as if there's an inequity, that they're putting more into that, they are investing more in that than is their husband. Now notice that equity all depends upon perception. It all depends upon what expectations people have. If the wife expects the husband to be equal with her with respect to disciplining the kids, then it's going to be quick for her to perceive an inequity. If she feels there should be an equity in terms of the housework and sharing the chores, she's quick to perceive there is an inequity whenever that doesn't happen. So the key really is expectations and perceptions. I've said on several occasions, and I'll repeat it here, that the most common complaint, communicatively, that wives have about their husband is that the husband does not share what's in his heart and what's in his head. And one reason why that complaint is so common is because for wives, the sharing of what's in the heart and what's in the head becomes a way of gauging the husband's level of investment in the relationship. And so, therefore, many husbands don't see it through that particular lens. They don't recognize sharing what's in the heart and head as making an investment in the relationship. In fact, for them, it's not even on their radar. And so, therefore, Edwin Hatfield and other researchers want to try and make us aware of what it is that people consider to be investments or non-investments. One example of this is that when it comes to disciplining children, wives are more likely to feel as if they're being made out to be the bad guy than are their husbands. This creates a kind of inequity because they feel as if always being cast into that role of bad guy not only creates costs, which is what we called earlier with the idea of interdependence theory from Kelly and Thibault, but also it's an inequity issue because the husband has, in a sense, not had to do anything negative, not had to take anything out of the account balance of goodwill he has toward the children because he hasn't disciplined them. But every time the wife disciplines the kids, she takes a little bit of that balance of goodwill out and it has to be restored again. So she gets frustrated that she has to keep diminishing this balance, so to speak, and the husband does not. And so this in turn might precipitate a conflict between the husband and the wife, which is an entirely different concept that we'll talk about later on in this particular course. At the end of the day, Hatfield and others simply want to say that the key to understanding family communication oftentimes is to ask the question, how does the communication represent an investment of some kind? You obviously don't need me to tell you this, but the research is very clear. The healthiest marriages, the most satisfying marriages, are those marriages where both spouses perceive relative equity in most areas. Now, there are some areas of a marriage where there can be some inequity. So, for example, husbands and wives can come to a kind of tacit or explicit agreement about who's going to do what when it comes to the chores. And it might be that the wife does a lot more of the household stuff than the husband does, and that's okay. They accept the inequity in that situation. That's fine. But more often than not, there's not an explicit agreement, and there might not even be a tacit agreement. Instead, it just happens. And so this inequity can build up resentment over the time that it happens, and the wife begins to feel bitter and resentful toward the husband because he's not helping out. And so therefore, this lack of investment, this presence of inequity, tends to strain and stress a marriage. Now, the research does suggest that couples tend to have, both individually and as a unit, certain things where the equity matters more. So, for example, many relationships, the notion of sex and physical relationships between husbands and wives is an area where both of them tend to see investments as being rather important things. Now, the research is clear. Husbands and wives tend to have different perceptions of investment when it comes to that portion of their marriage, but that's one area where there, generally speaking, needs to be perceived equity. On the other hand, there are other areas where that is less the case. Yet again, we can also say that generally speaking, if you line up all the areas of a marriage where there could possibly be equity, if there's equity in more of them, in fact, much more of them than there is in inequity, then that marriage is probably on pretty firm footing. Chances are pretty good it's going to be a healthy marriage and a satisfying marriage. But the more of those many different areas where those are perceived inequity, and in fact, the more of those areas where one of the two spouses perceives there to be an inequity, that marriage is more likely to face stress and strain, there's likely to be more conflict, and the relationship is not likely to be as healthy as it otherwise could be. And so, equity theory, for many researchers, is a very helpful way of understanding the kinds of communication that occurs in a marital context. So, whether it be critical systems theory or functional theory, equity theory, interdependence theory, these are broad lenses for understanding what happens in family communication. If I was a student right now, I'd be asking myself what kinds of lenses that we've talked about so far might best explain the kinds of communication that you see in your family. So if you think back to the last exchange you had with your parents, you might be able to identify how that exchange can be best understood when seen through the lens of equity or when seen through the lens of function. And so much of this course is about you applying these ideas, and I certainly invite you to do that. So these first few broad lenses, I think, are helpful for understanding family communication, but by no means are they the only lenses for understanding family communication. And so subsequent videos will look at other kinds of lenses for understanding family communication.